The subterranean city never slept, yet it always held a chilling, thickened silence. Deep beneath the black stone alleys where sunlight was only a worn-out legend, Elias Thorne existed. 5 years prior, when his alchemist father had turned to ash and his secret formulas vanished into the ether, Elias had reluctantly inherited the Ossuary's veil. It was no mere antique shop. It was a carefully controlled gateway, a controlled fissure in the barrier between the quick and the dead. The Ossuary's veil lived up to its name. Heavy black wooden shelves were crammed with forgotten manuscripts, skin-bound ledgers Elias never dared open, and hundreds of ceramic urns containing things that should not be named. The air was perpetually heavy with the scent of old paper, quartz dust, and a bone-deep coldness, a chill that stemmed not from temperature, but from proximity to the infinite. Elias was bound here, forced to abandon his half-finished studies of ancient languages, the Babylonian scrolls he cherished, to become the custodian of what he bitterly called his mandated legacy. Elias's burden was not just the maintenance of physical inventory, but the terrifying supernatural balance. The core of the shop was the summoning ritual, performed in the marble chamber, a small, deep room where all sound was violently muffled. Upon the pedestal of dark marble, stone quarried from a pit closed long ago for unspeakable reasons, rested the bronze brazier, the cinerarium, always cold to the touch. It was never permitted to heat conventionally, but was maintained by a single, continuously fed coal. Its temperature had to be a contradiction, hot enough to burn, yet cold enough not to shatter the spiritual restraint it imposed. The primary fuel was Stygian incense. This was a potent substance refined through a complex alchemical process his father had spent decades perfecting, ground fine as volcanic ash, jet black, and giving off a sickly sweet, acrid odor. When sprinkled on the coal, it did not flare. It melted and rose in a column of dense, spiraling lime-green smoke, a tenuous yet rigid pillar. That smoke column was the tether between the Ossuary's veil and the shroud of the spirit world. The rule was ironclad, seared into Elias's mind by his father's sharp warnings. Interruption is release. Thorne, his father had rasped, his voice like grinding stone. When the door opens, it can only be closed by completing the protocol or letting the incense burn down through its natural cycle. If you dare cut it short, if the brazier is overturned or the coal quenched violently, the summoned spirit does not dissipate. It is torn from the tether, and that chaotic energy materializes, trapped in the boundary, becoming a permanent threat to all that lives. Elias wore those words like a chain. His job was not that of a dealer, but of a gatekeeper, a custodian of the limit between the material and the immaterial. Lyra, the young assistant, was the only one who shared this burden. She asked no questions, arriving at the Ossuary's veil 5 years ago as a lost orphan and quickly accepting the establishment's strange truth. She was the pragmatist, the physical manager of Elias's requirements, responsible for maintaining the special coal supply and ensuring the marble chamber's precise humidity and coldness. Their relationship was defined by caution and icy distance. They rarely spoke, communicating through nods or cautionary glances, both existing in a state of high alert. They never allowed themselves to forget the secret they served, a powerful instrument capable of destroying its very users. Before each client arrived, Elias would re-examine his father's worn ledger, checking the sketch diagrams of the coal, the precise calculations of incense mass required for various summonings, and notes on the tenacity of different spirits. Most spirits were weak vibrations, easily managed. But there was always the risk of an entity with a will too strong, one that might leverage the temporary connection to escape. Elias enforced a chilling ethical distance. He refused to believe in the sacred nature of the ritual, viewing it purely as a forbidden alchemical technique, a formula. He told himself he was serving a function, not a faith. The truth was, he fought a terrible temptation. On long, clientless nights, with only the soft ticking of the ancient clock, he often stared at the jars of Stygian incense. He, the scholar of ancient tongues, knew this gateway could unlock humanity's greatest historical mysteries, the locations of burned libraries, the true meaning of forgotten symbols. He could summon his own father, not to say goodbye, but to extract the missing alchemical formulas or the secrets of the gate itself. But that very temptation was his greatest burden. To use the rite for personal gain would shatter the cold distance he maintained, and he would be no better than the grasping clients he served. He always chose restraint, believing that control could only be maintained through absolute indifference. "Lyra," Elias called, his voice a dry whisper. "Prepare the marble chamber. We have a client. Arriving. Ensure the brazier is ready, the coal at peak equilibrium." Lyra nodded, disappearing silently. Elias turned back to his desk, where he pretended to sort rusted ancient coins. But his mind was below, with the chilling brazier, the door about to open, and the promise of chaos if he, or anyone else, made the slightest error. He was the warden of the Ossuary's Vale, and his burden had only just begun. The initial wave of clients solidified Elias's quiet disgust, demonstrating the rapid corruption of purpose. First came Vera, a grief-stricken woman seeking the soul of her dead lover, not for a final farewell, but to pinpoint the exact location of a stolen antique skull needed for collateral. Next was Silas, a shrewd smuggler, attempting to exploit the ghost of a murdered associate for the location and key to a buried cache of contraband. These summonings succeeded, but they revealed a bitter truth. The gate was being used for profit, not peace. After each ritual concluded, the Stygian incense left a residue of cold ash on Elias's conscience, hardening the sense that he was merely catering to the avarice of the living, rather than the rest of the dead. The strain escalated sharply when Gareth, a wealthy and vicious collector, appeared. Gareth sought not information about objects, but absolute control. He demanded the phantom of a deceased business rival recite bank account passwords. When the soul, weak and resentful, attempted to resist, Gareth, driven mad by fear and avarice, reacted violently. He thrust his hand out, slamming the bronze brazier from the marble pedestal. The glowing coal and a handful of crushed incense scattered across the stone floor. The communication was brutally severed. Instead of dissipating, a freezing gust and a choked, subterranean scream echoed through the Ossuary's Vale. Though Elias and Lyra quickly restored order, the incident left a physical and supernatural fracture, a horrific lesson that breaking the ritual did not merely end communication, but released a portion of chaotic energy into their world. Elias realized he was not only serving the rite, but actively controlling the resulting malignancy. The climax arrived when Inspector Marius Kale, haggard and desperate, came seeking clues to catch an elusive copycat killer. He demanded the summoning of the soul of Dr. Silas Vane, the whispering surgeon, a notorious serial murderer. Vane was an entity too strong, too malign, to be contained by the incense's rules. The moment Vane's presence materialized, the air grew crushing, and the brazier began to shriek. Vane offered no information. Instead, he manifested raw psychic strength and attempted immediate materialization. His focus instantly centered on Lyra, the weakest point of resistance. Recognizing the absolute peril, Elias, for the first time in years, actively employed his father's forbidden alchemical knowledge. He snatched the vial of tincture of severance, a fluid banned for its destructive volatility, and poured it directly onto the smoldering coal. A thick column of black smoke erupted with a terrifying, piercing shriek, utterly extinguishing Vane's presence and saving Lyra. This act was Elias's definitive transition from a resentful servant to a guardian. In the harrowing calm following that night, Elias felt exhausted and shaken. Lyra was safe, but he understood that the Ossuary's Vale could not continue its operations. As he cleaned the debris, his hand trembled, accidentally spilling a final measure of residual Stygian incense onto the brazier, inadvertently triggering the ritual. This time, the presence that materialized was his father. The ghost did not reveal missing secrets of the gate or any alchemical formulas. Instead, He offered his son profound release, acknowledging that the legacy had been an intolerable burden. He urged Elias to seal the place. He reminded Elias that he had given up his study of ancient languages for this work, yet it was precisely that knowledge of ancient tongues, the strength of binding names and symbols, that was the most powerful tool to lock the threshold forever. His father vanished, leaving Elias alone. The sense of oppressive duty lifted entirely. Elias resolved to use his long-delayed and forbidden scholarship to permanently seal the Ossuary's veil, ending the cycle of reluctant servitude and stepping into a future defined by newfound freedom and responsibility, protecting the world by irrevocably locking away what had once been his inheritance. The Ossuary's veil was not a place of solace. Elias had known this for a long time, but with every ritual performed, the truth lodged deeper into his marrow like a shard of cold glass. His job was not that of a spiritual intermediary. He was a gate opener, a custodian of the infrastructure, ensuring that the fragile threshold between life and death remained open just long enough for the living to plunder final pieces of information from departed souls. Elias maintained the necessary professional frigidity. He wore a thick, charcoal tweed coat, not to ward off the chill of the catacombs, but to create a physical barrier between himself and the frenzied emotions of his clientele. Lyra, his young apprentice, operated like a shadow. Her silence was an unspoken endorsement of his detachment. She refined the Stygian incense with utmost precision, knowing that any error in the compound, a blend of resin from toxic roots and pulverized bone dust, could render the summoned spirit volatile. The first evening the corruption of purpose became truly evident was when Vera arrived. Vera was a beautiful woman, her eyes swollen from weeping. She was draped in expensive mourning attire, and from the first glance, Elias felt a profound distaste, not for her pain, but for the calculation hidden within it. She sought the soul of her husband, Arthur, who had recently died in a complex traffic accident involving artifact smuggling. "I only need 5 minutes," Vera whispered, her voice fractured by manufactured sobs. 5 minutes to say goodbye." Elias nodded, pulling up his sleeve. The bronze censer was always cold, regardless of the ambient temperature. Lyra placed hot embers from the secret furnace into the basin, and Elias carefully sprinkled a measured dose of the Stygian incense onto them. The smoke rose, a pale gray, smelling of damp earth and light sulfur, filling the space directly above the censer. It twisted, slowly coalescing into a blurred figure, the wraith of Arthur. Arthur's soul appeared, weak and utterly confused. "Vera." Arthur's voice, amplified by the smoke, sounded like dry leaves swept by the wind. Vera knelt, her hands gripping the edge of the marble table. Elias stood silent in the corner, ready to intervene should the communication be disrupted. "Arthur, my love," Vera began, but there was no tenderness in her tone. "I don't have much time. Tell me, precisely where did you hide the ancient Quetzalcoatl skull?" Silence. The spirit seemed to shudder. "Vera, you promised to leave me be. I told you it was dangerous. Tell me." Vera hissed, shedding the veneer of distress entirely. "If they don't find it, they will think I took it. We will lose everything. Hurry, Arthur. I don't want to have to do this." Elias closed his eyes. This was no farewell. This was a final interrogation regarding illicit inheritance. He felt a deep contempt for Vera, and equally for himself, for being the guarantor of this squalid transaction. Under the pressure of the Stygian incense, a solvent for the soul, compelling it to reveal truth, Arthur finally broke. He described the location of the skull, hidden in a wall cavity behind his personal library, shielded by a rare copy of the Necronomicon. As the last word was spoken, Vera sprang up, bothering neither with thanks nor a final goodbye. She ran from the room, leaving Arthur to dissipate slowly into the thin smoke. When the incense died down, Elias inhaled the deep scent of ashes and exploitation. "Log the entry," he instructed Lyra, his voice arid. "Purpose, asset location information. Reliability, absolute. Moral cost, unacceptable. Lyra merely nodded, her eyes never leaving the empty censer. They cleaned and prepared for the next viewing, attempting to wash away the grit of the previous transaction. A few nights later, the door opened for Silas. Silas was not a grieving party, but a petty smuggler in a frayed woolen suit, the scent of cheap liquor clinging to his skin. He represented the type of raw, unconcealed avarice Elias had come to see as characteristic of the world above. Silas wanted to speak with the soul of Finn, a partner killed during an armed confrontation. Finn was neither friend nor relative. Finn was the only one who knew the lock code to a strongbox containing illicit funds buried at the old docks. No wasting time, Silas grumbled, clutching his cap. Ask it for the numbers. Just the numbers. I don't care how he feels. All I need is a 12-digit sequence. Elias felt a throbbing pain behind his temples. Silas's crudeness was an offense to the sanctity of death, however corrupted the ritual had become. Lyra, maintaining her deadly calm, performed the sensing. When Finn materialized, he was a fainter entity than Arthur, perhaps because his death had been more violent and recent. Finn seemed still caught in a state of shock. You? What have you done to me, Silas? Finn's cry echoed in the chamber, carrying a terror that not even death had alleviated. I just need this, you idiot, Silas growled, slamming his fist on the table. What's the code? The iron box you hid in the fish hold. Tell me the numbers. The soul of Finn wavered. No, I won't tell you. You won't get it. You don't deserve it. You betrayed me. Silas ground his teeth, rage flaring. He didn't understand that the rules of the outside world didn't apply here. Elias knew that if Silas continued to provoke it, the smoke would dissolve, and the ritual would fail. A simple failure, not a catastrophe, but a disruption nonetheless. Lyra, increase the dosage, Elias ordered. Lyra immediately added a fine pinch of pulverized bone dust to the embers. The incense intensified, the supernatural pressure bearing down on Finn's soul increasing. Finn let out a sharp, pained shriek, compelled by the magical restraint of the incense. 9, 1, 8. Finn began to shake as he recited. 4, 7, 2. No, I can't do it. Keep talking, Silas shouted, leaning close into the smoke. Finn, finally crushed by the ritual's compulsion, completed the 12-digit sequence. Immediately after, his spirit shriveled, giving off a small pop of cold air, and vanished completely. Silas smiled, a radiant smile of filthy triumph. He tossed a crumpled wad of bills onto the table and departed as quickly as Vera. After Silas left, silence returned, but it was no longer the reverent hush of a library. It was the deadly silence of a plundered tomb. Elias leaned against the doorway. His revulsion was no longer merely theoretical. It had become a mental ulcer. He had learned ancient languages to seek eternal truths, philosophy, history, esoteric texts on the structure of reality. Now, he used that knowledge to translate the final whispers of bank codes, buried treasures, and fraudulent schemes. He watched Lyra carefully scrape the cold gray ash from the censer. Lyra, he called. Do you ever wonder why we continue? Lyra paused, her eyes still fixed on her task. Your father left it to you, Elias. We maintain order. Order, Elias scoffed. We maintain a trading post for the greed of the living. The souls summoned find no release. They find compulsion. This ash, he gestured to the remnants of the Stygian incense, feels like it's settling on my mind. He stepped toward the small, unglazed window that opened onto the dark alleys of the underworld city, where light was only a distant promise. Lyra was right. He was bound by this legacy, forced to maintain this gate for the most ignoble of purposes. He was the keeper, not of grand secrets, but of petty tricks and the unresolved cases of avarice. Elias took a breath, swallowing the bitterness. He knew the rules explicitly. The ritual must not be interrupted. The consequences would be terrible, far beyond a mere failed transaction. But the corruption of purpose, this perpetual witnessing of exploitation, had laid the groundwork for a fissure in his conscience. He was ready for a client to break the rules, to see what truly happened when this gate was left uncontrolled. And then Gareth arrived, bringing a level of cruelty and violence that would turn Elias's secret wish into a nightmare. Gareth arrived. He was unlike the previous clients of the Ossuary's Vale, those who came with shoulders slumped by loss or furtive in their desperation. Gareth was a man cast in arrogance and money, his perfectly tailored suit hiding an unvarnished cruelty. He was a collector of ancient artifacts, a hunter of lost legacies, and he carried a haughty air that felt wholly incompatible with the deathly quiet of the underground bookshop. His purpose was not artifact, nor solace, but absolute dominion, even over the dead. "I need to speak with Gerald Hawthorne," Gareth announced, his sharp voice echoing gratingly in the reading room. "An unfortunately deceased business rival. He holds the access codes to an account I require." Elias looked at Gareth, a wave of cold revulsion tightening his gut. Lyra, ever vigilant and non-judgmental, mechanically prepared the ritual, setting purified charcoal embers into the cold brass censer. The Stygian Incense, ground from cursed bark and purified bone dust, released a scent of damp musk and metal. Elias knew the ritual should only serve as a temporary bridge, a reluctant concession for those needing true farewell, but under the service of men like Gareth, it became an instrument of supernatural torture. As the thick, white-blue smoke began to coil from the censer, Elias instructed Gareth to sit in the chair opposite, between the two marble pedestals. The dim candlelight rendered Gareth's face pale, yet his eyes shone bright with unconcealed avarice. Elias began to chant the ancient incantations required to stabilize the portal, words he had memorized from his father, though he always felt they tainted the true knowledge of archaic script he yearned to study. The spirit of Gerald Hawthorne appeared. He was a trembling, gray shade, radiating utter terror, not from his death, but from being dragged back. Hawthorne tried to speak, but his voice was only a weak moan, distorted by the haze of the incense. "The codes," Gareth pressed, his voice taut. "Provide me the access key to the Aegis 9 account." Now, Hawthorne shook his head. That resistance, though feeble, was enough to make the brass censer shudder faintly. In the world of rituals, the summoned spirit's defiance was profoundly dangerous. Spirits were not puppets forced into obedience. They were called, but they retained their will, especially when they realized their presence was being exploited post-mortem. Gareth was unused to opposition. He was accustomed to everything bowing to his money and power. "Speak," Gareth roared, fear mixed with anger causing him to lose control, "or I will ensure your spirit never finds rest." Hawthorne's soul responded with a sound like a choking sob, then seemed to gather the last vestiges of its strength to utter a single sentence, but it was not the code. "I have incinerated it. All of it. You shall have nothing." Silence descended upon the Ossuary's Vale. Elias felt the blood freeze in his veins. This was not a disrupted communication. This was open defiance in a space built upon strict adherence. Gareth completely lost control. His greed and panic at realizing his prize was utterly gone drove him to a violent, irrational, and base reaction. He sprang from the chair, his eyes wild. "Damn you!" he screamed, sweeping his arm forward viciously. His target was neither Elias nor Lyra, but the brass censer resting on the white marble pedestal. The censer, containing the delicate balance between the physical world and the death realm, was violently struck. Clang! The sound of heavy metal striking stone echoed jarringly, shattering the centuries of stillness in the room. The censer overturned, rolling across the cold stone floor. Half-burnt charcoal, bright red embers carrying the purest energy of the ritual, scattered everywhere. A handful of pulverized, purified incense was crushed and spread, mixing with the grime of the material world. The communication portal collapsed instantly, but it did not just close. It was torn open. Gerald Hawthorne's spirit vanished immediately, but not in the usual peaceful dissipating smoke. Instead, a surge of raw, chaotic energy flooded the room. A bone-deep cold wind swept through the Ossuary's Vale. It was not air, it was the chill of the death realm, where life and warmth were absent. The books on the shelves rattled violently, and every candle in the room, save for the two nearest Elias, sputtered out, plunging the chamber into near absolute darkness. A choked, distorted, and supernatural shriek sounded. It was not Hawthorne's scream, but the sound of the portal itself grappling with the violent disruption. Elias felt the pressure in his ears skyrocket, as if a gigantic, invisible hand was squeezing him. Lyra, standing nearer the door, trembled and clutched her arms. She had witnessed hundreds of summonings, but never this raw breach and its immediate aftermath. Elias acted on instinct, overriding the shock. He was not a warrior, but he was the keeper. "Lyra, the ceiling cloth," he commanded, his voice strained. Gareth, still standing there, his eyes wide, now not with anger, but with pure horror at the realization of the cost of his folly. He stumbled backward, tripping, trying to escape the shaking room. Elias dropped to his knees on the floor, where the hot embers were scorching black marks onto the stone. He could not allow these embers to burn out this way, or the incense to dissipate in chaos. The embers were the medium that maintained the connection. If they burned out in an uncontrolled physical environment, the supernatural energy would continue to leak into the room. He quickly used his bare hands, ignoring the searing pain, collecting the burning charcoal and the remaining incense, trying to force them back into the tipped censer. Lyra, despite her terror, quickly brought a piece of black silk cloth infused with protective herbs. They used it to wrap the overturned censer, attempting to seal the leaking energy. As the censer was temporarily sealed, the bone-deep cold subsided, the shriek diminished to a weak hiss, and finally, silence. Elias gasped for breath, feeling more exhausted than after a week of sleepless nights. He turned to look at the marble pedestal. The spot where the censer had been violently displaced bore a deep crack, not just on the stone's surface, but seemingly into the very fabric of the altar, a supernatural fissure. "The consequences, they are terrible," Elias murmured, not to Lyra but to himself. Gareth, having regained a measure of composure, tried to approach Elias. "What just happened? I will pay. I will pay whatever you want. Just don't tell anyone." "You broke it," Elias said, his voice low and cold. "You did not merely cut off the communication. You opened a door, and instead of closing, it was overturned. The chaotic portion of that gateway has been dragged in here." Elias accepted no compensation from Gareth beyond the initial service fee. He simply ordered him to disappear, emphasizing that if he returned, the consequences would be far greater than an overturned censer. After Gareth left, Lyra cleaned the remnants. She discovered that the censer was not just slightly dented. It seemed to have been frozen by the sudden cold of the chaotic energy. "We contained it," Lyra said, but her voice held no conviction. Elias looked at the fissure in the marble pedestal, which had been the solid anchor point for the censer. He recognized the terrible truth. All this time, he had believed his job was to serve the living by calling the dead. But this incident taught him a brutal lesson. His burden was not the service of the ritual, but the control of it. If a greedy fool like Gareth could so easily unleash such chaos with a mere fit of temper, this place was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The Ossuary's Vale was not merely an antique shop and reading room. It was a trap, and Elias was its unwilling guardian. This event was a stark warning, preparing him for the real threat that was now approaching. The temporary silence was heavy, a suffocating blanket woven from metaphysical dread. Elias knelt by the marble pedestal, ignoring the stinging ache in his hands from where he had grabbed the embers. The fissure Gareth had caused was wider and deeper than it looked. It was a wound in the reality of the Ossuary's Vale. Lyra finished wrapping the last shard of the censer in the black silk, securing it with an elaborate knot designed to stifle residual energy. She approached Elias cautiously. "The fissure," she whispered, pointing with a trembling finger. "It's breathing." Elias had already felt it. The stone was radiating the unnatural cold of the void, but beneath that cold, there was a faint, rhythmic pulse. He reached out and placed his palm near the jagged wound. The stone instantly chilled his blood, but simultaneously, A sensation pierced his consciousness. It was not the lingering echo of chaos, but a new, intelligent cold. Gerald Hawthorne had been a mere shade, a panicked remnant of a man. This presence was different. This was malice, a malicious entity, an opportunistic predator that had clung to the chaotic tear, exploiting the instantaneous failure of the containment spell. It was powerful, ancient, and utterly foreign to the familiar geography of the death realm that Elias usually navigated. It was a hitchhiker. Elias felt the subtle difference in the energy signature. The raw disorder of the breach had provided a momentary conduit, and this entity, far more potent and patient than a human spirit, had slipped through before Lyra could seal the breach. It was now anchored within the crack, trapped between worlds, using the stone as a temporary cage. He retracted his hand sharply, wiping the faint frost from his palm onto his trousers. It's not residual energy, Lyra. Something came through. Something that wasn't summoned. Lyra's eyes widened, reflecting the terrified truth. To summon the dead was dangerous. To allow something else to enter was catastrophic. What does it want? She asked, her voice barely audible. Elias shook his head, looking not at the crack, but around the room, at the towering shelves of forbidden texts and dangerous histories. The presence felt like a searing hunger, but not for flesh or life. It hungered for knowledge. In that moment, a profound sense of recognition washed over Elias, not from his own mind, but projected from the fissure. The entity recognized the Ossuary's veil. It recognized the deep structure of the place, built not just as a shop, but as a vault, a repository of the lost lore of necromancy and the arcane boundaries. Elias was merely the guardian holding the keys. He knelt closer to the crack, his jaw clenched, and pressed his consciousness against the invading chill. He reached out with the mental training his father had ingrained in him, the ability to map the spiritual terrain. He saw, or rather, he felt a flicker of ancient shadow, a presence bound to the stone, trying to spread its influence into the foundational layers of the shop. If it succeeded, it would gain access to the restricted archives beneath the veil, the very texts Elias had long been prohibited from fully studying. The entity had found its way in, but it was not yet free. It was testing the limits of its cage. Elias pushed back with the protective remnants of the censor's energy, the faint residue of the Stygian incense acting as a momentary shield. The pressure instantly intensified, causing the two remaining candles to flare violently, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the concept of safety. "You are in the way," the presence hissed telepathically, a soundless articulation that felt like ice grinding on bone. "Move aside, Guardian. The archive belongs to the Elder Paths." Elias stood up, his gaze hard and fixed on the fissure. This was not a spirit seeking rest or revenge. This was an invasive entity seeking to reclaim or plunder forbidden knowledge, knowledge that Elias was bound by his family legacy to protect. The granite floor of the reading room, the silent witness to centuries of sorrow, now held a secret prisoner, a forbidden presence, actively working to escape its cold confines. Elias finally understood the true purpose of his isolation here, not to serve clients, but to stand guard against the inevitable breaches caused by human folly. He had to stabilize the censor's seal, but more pressingly, he had to research how to destroy something that had slipped through the veil using nothing but brute chaotic force. He glanced at the stacks of books in the back corner, those dusty tomes he had always ignored as dry scholarly works. Now, they were his only arsenal. The fight had begun, and it wasn't against a dead man's ghost, but against an intelligent force that had been waiting for centuries for the right kind of fool, like Gareth, to tear open the wall. The underground city rarely relinquished its worst secrets to those who lived above, but the night Inspector Marius Cale stepped into the Ossuary's veil, that separating membrane felt paper-thin. Cale was a weary man, possessing the desperate look of one who had chased a monster for too long. He sought no treasure or healing, only a truth painful enough to resolve a copycat murder case that had rattled the city's precarious sense of safety. "We need Dr. Vane," Cale said, his voice dry as dust. "Silas Vane, the whispering surgeon. We know he was caught and died in prison 10 years ago, but the current imitator has replicated his cuts precisely. We need him to tell us how he selected his victims. We need an explanation." The name fell into the reading room like a cold stone. Elias felt Lyra stiffen beside him. Vane was no ordinary ghost. He was a condensation of systemic violence and cruelty, a soul that had been rotten even before his body died. To summon such an entity was not consultation, it was provocation. "Inspector," Elias said, his voice carrying a new sharpness, one their previous dealings had not required. "The spirits here are bound by peace. Entities like Vane, they never rest. The risk is unacceptable. He is too potent." Cale placed a heavy pouch of currency on the table. "Our risk is greater, Thorne. This door either closes forever, or it opens in service of justice." Elias looked into Cale's eyes and recognized the terrible truth. Cale had no choice. Nor did he. The brazier was not just a tool, it was a binding oath. If he possessed the ability to prevent a murder, that burden weighed heavier than any alchemical knowledge. With a heavy nod, Elias prepared the rite. Lyra, though visibly terrified, was professional, handling the highest concentration of underworld incense they kept reserved. This time, the embers did not glow with their usual dull orange flame. They gave off a faint, pale blue light, and the smoke rose vertically, utterly unstirred, like a magnetic column. "Stand absolutely still, Inspector," Elias warned, "and on no account speak his name again." The wait stretched into an eternity. When Vane's spirit manifested, it was not the usual wispy silhouette. The air in the reading room thickened, cold enough to numb the skin, and a sickening scent of old blood and disinfectant flooded the space. The brazier, always cool to the touch, began to shriek, as if the metal were being stretched and twisted from within. Silas Vane possessed no discernible face, merely a swirling vortex of shadow that filled the height of a man. But he needed no features to convey his presence. Instead of the usual muffled vocal communication, a penetrating, static hiss reverberated in their minds, like 1,000 razor blades honing themselves against one another. Cale, oblivious to the sheer supernatural horror, immediately stepped forward. "Dr. Vane, why these cuts? What did you do to your victims before?" The hiss cut Cale off. Vane cared nothing for questions or the justice of the living. He cared only for power and disruption. "Stupidity," the entity whispered, its voice echoing in their skulls, not through their ears. "You opened the door to ask about what was past. I have moved far beyond that." Vane began to materialize. The shadows twisted, and the structure of the room seemed to wobble. A claw formed from the frigid air, and it was not directed at Cale. It lunged for Lyra. Lyra was the weakest point in the ritual, the gateway closest to life. Vane, intelligent and malignant, recognized that absorbing Lyra's vitality would grant him enough power to fully materialize, tear apart the Ossuary's veil's fragile boundaries, and escape. "Elias!" Lyra shrieked, her cry muffled by the air pressure. Vane's icy claw touched Lyra's shoulder. Elias saw her eyes roll back in agony, not physical pain, but her very soul being stretched. In that instant, Elias understood the ritual had failed. He was no longer a servant. Keeping the embers burning was not protecting them. It was fueling the monster. He recalled the terrifying lesson from Gareth's disruption. Breaking the ritual would unleash chaotic energy. But this time, he had to break it with decisive force. All the alchemical knowledge he had tried to bury over the last 5 years resurfaced. He lunged toward the locked cabinet behind his father's desk, his hand shaking as he snatched a small, dark glass vial. It was the tincture of severance, a forbidden formula. It was designed not to banish, but to destroy and utterly sever the link between the material and the supernatural. The liquid inside was thick and deep violet. It was never meant to touch the underworld embers. With no time for hesitation, Elias ripped off the stopper. He squeezed his eyes shut, an involuntary action, and poured the entire solution into the shrieking brazier. The moment the liquid met the burning charcoal, a supernatural detonation occurred. It was not the sound of fire or breaking glass, but the sound of rending, like a stretched metallic sheet being ripped apart. A plume of black, corrosive smoke erupted, higher and faster than any incense had before. This smoke smelled of sulfur and molten metal, and it immediately enveloped Vane's entity. Vane's hiss turned into a shriek of visceral, absolute pain. The sound did not just echo in the room. It seemed to travel backward through time, reversed toward its very origin. The entity tried to resist, thrashing within the column of black smoke, but the tincture of severance did not permit partial disruption. It was absolute cessation. In less than 3 seconds, Vane vanished. The column of black smoke dissipated, leaving a layer of black, acrid ash over every surface. The brazier cracked in 3 places, not from heat, but from the shockwave of the severing. Lyra collapsed, gasping, her body shuddering from shock. Cale, who had been thrown against a bookshelf, rose, his eyes wide with pure horror. Elias stood there, the empty vial in his hand. The exhaustion was not merely physical. It was a colossal drain of psychic energy. He had saved Lyra, and perhaps the Ossuary's veil itself, but he had shattered the ironclad rules in the most brutal way possible. He was no longer a servant of the ritual. He had become its controller, employing forbidden knowledge to fight what the ritual brought forth. The lesson was stark. This door was ready to unleash uncontrollable evil, and only active determination, not passive obedience, could keep it closed. Elias Thorne lived in servitude to the Ossuary's veil, a dim antique shop and reading room nestled deep within the subterranean city, where light was only a distant promise. He had reluctantly inherited the guardianship from his alchemist father, who had passed 5 years prior, forcing Elias to abandon his true passion, the study of ancient linguistics. The veil was a gateway, contingent on ritual. If the refined Stygian incense was burned in the perpetually cold brazier, and the coals were kept continuously lit for a precise duration, one could communicate with the deceased. The rule was ironclad. Interruption carried horrific consequence. Elias and his young assistant, Lyra, maintained the mortuary silence of the place, existing in a state of cold vigilance and icy distance from the secret they served. Elias's burden was not merely maintaining the ritual, but restraining the powerful temptation of the ritual itself. The story began with the first clients, those who utilized the ritual for nakedly personal gain, stoking Elias's private revulsion. First came Vera, a woman consumed by grief, seeking the spirit of her lost lover, not for a final farewell, but to ascertain the precise location of a stolen ancient skull box to absolve herself of guilt. Next was Silas, a shrewd smuggler, who sought to leverage the wraith of a recently slain associate for the buried coordinates to a hidden cache of contraband. These summonings succeeded, yet they made one thing brutally clear. The door was being used for profit, not for healing. Each time the ritual concluded, the Stygian incense smoke left a layer of cold ash on Elias's psyche, cementing the feeling that he was only a servant to the greed of the living, and not the peace of the dead. Tension escalated sharply with the arrival of Gareth, a wealthy and ruthless collector. Gareth sought not information about objects, but absolute control. He forced the ghost of a dead business rival to dictate bank account codes. When the spirit, weakened and resentful, attempted to resist, Gareth, in a sudden fit of greedy fear, reacted violently. He shoved the brazier hard off its marble pedestal. Half-burnt coals and a crushed handful of incense scattered across the stone floor. The communication was brutally severed. Instead of simply dissolving, an arctic blast of wind and a strangled shriek echoed through the Ossuary's veil. Though Elias and Lyra quickly restored order, the incident left a physical and supernatural fracture, a terrifying lesson that breaking the ritual did not just stop communication. It released a portion of chaotic energy into their world. Elias realized he had to control the ritual, not just serve it. The climax was reached when Inspector Marius Cale, exhausted and desperate, arrived seeking clues to capture a copycat killer. He demanded the summoning of the soul of Dr. Silas Vane, the Whispering Surgeon, a notoriously powerful serial killer. Vane was an entity too strong, too profoundly malevolent to be confined by the rules of incense. The moment Vane manifested, the air became heavy, and the brazier began to whine. Vane offered no information. He exerted sheer supernatural force, attempting to materialize. His focus immediately shifted to Lyra, the weakest point. Recognizing the absolute danger, Elias, for the first time in years, actively used his father's forbidden alchemical knowledge. He seized the bottle of tincture of severance, a prohibited, destructive liquid, and dumped it directly onto the dying coals. A thick, inky smoke erupted with a terrifying, high-pitched shriek, extinguishing Vane's presence entirely and saving Lyra. The act was Elias's decisive shift from servant to guardian. Elias leaned against the cold stone wall, taking shallow breaths in the violently purified air. The empty vial of tincture of severance lay on the floor, its dark purple fluid having completed its mission. Unlike Gareth's supernatural chaos, the conclusion wrought by the tincture had a cold, chemical, and malevolent finality. Its scent, a blend of sharp sulfur and burning metal, clung to Elias's lungs. Lyra sat huddled in the leather armchair in the corner, still in silent shock. Though physically unharmed, she had seen and felt the sort of horror no living person should endure. Elias, who had always maintained a sterile distance from her, felt a terrible, shared intimacy in the aftermath. He had saved her, but at the cost of breaking every rule he had obeyed. He was no longer the keeper of the ritual. He was its destroyer. "Are you all right, Lyra?" His voice was hoarse. Lyra offered only a weak nod, clutching the woolen blanket tightly. Elias didn't press her to speak. His physical exhaustion was profound, worse than any physical wound. He felt as though he had wrestled the darkness itself, and though he had won, the darkness had taken a portion of his life force. He looked at the brazier on the marble pedestal. It was not just haunted, it was ruined. The interior ceramic was severely cracked under the heat and chemical reaction of the tincture. For 5 years, Elias had maintained the brazier out of fear of his dead father and the compulsion of his inheritance. But after witnessing what Silas Vane could do, that fear had curdled into absolute revulsion. He could no longer accept the Ossuary's veil as a serviceable gateway. It was a vulnerability, a cancer on the world. Elias began to clean. This was not the usual careful tidying after a summoning. This was the decontamination of a place poisoned by pure evil. He carefully shoveled the remnants of the cold coals, Stygian ash, and streaks of black chemical oil. His hand shook uncontrollably, not just from exhaustion, but from the guilt of using a forbidden formula. As he collected the last fragments of the remaining Stygian incense from a nearby tin, a clumsy accident occurred. His forearm struck the shelf, and the tin slid from his exhausted fingers. A final handful of incense scattered, falling directly into the cracked brazier, where tiny embers still glowed from the night before, a persistent residue that never seemed to fully extinguish. Smoke rose. This time, there was no terrifying shriek, no skin-crawling coldness, or the grasping hunger of grasping entities. The smoke was softer, the familiar silvery gray, and it gathered within the broken vessel. The air did not become heavy, but unnaturally still, as if time itself had paused. A spirit manifested, not the featureless wraith of Vane or Vera, but Elias Thorne, Elias's alchemist father. He stood, slightly translucent, wearing the familiar knitted wool cardigan he always wore in his chilly laboratory. Elias collapsed onto the floor, utterly blindsided. "Father." Alistair did not smile, but his eyes, cold for so many years, now held a glimmer of relief. "You haven't burned that incense in 5 years just to speak to me," Alistair said, his voice like wind whistling through a closed door. "This was an accident, and a fortuitous one." Elias stammered. I had to use the tincture of severance. I broke everything. Silas Vane." "I know." Alistair cut him off, His calm a quality Elias had rarely seen while he was alive. Vain is what we call an anchor entity, a soul so thoroughly bound to its action and malice in the mortal plane that it can materialize. That is why I always forbade you from attempting to call upon powerful spirits. A cold anger rose in Elias. Why did you never teach me that? Why didn't you teach me how to lock the door, rather than how to service it? Alistair tilted his head slightly. Because I knew you would never learn how to lock it using my formulas. You always sought answers in vials and refined metals. I tried to keep the business going, hoping you would find balance, but I failed. Alistair's spirit drifted closer, though his physical distance remained fixed. Son, I didn't come to give you a final secret formula or a revelation about the gate. My alchemy was merely thin paint. It was only the medium for communication, not the key to containment. Alistair's gaze swept across the room, settling on the dusty shelves Elias hadn't touched in 5 years, the volumes of archaic linguistics, the lexicons of forgotten civilizations, the treatises on the nature of runes and glyphs. The rules of the veil are not iron, they are language. The power to seal a supernatural gate lies not in refined minerals, but in the structure of understanding. It lies in the characters, in the grammar of binding and severance, Alistair explained. You gave up ancient languages to pursue my failed alchemy. That was my mistake. Alistair sighed, though he needed no air. You performed this job out of duty, but you concluded it with the instinct of a guardian. You used the tincture because you understood that the door needed to be closed. It was broken. It was corrupted by avarice and malice. You are no longer the servant. You are the closer. Elias's fear evaporated, replaced by terrible clarity. He had spent his life reading, translating, and studying ancient tongues, believing it merely an academic hobby. He had sought power in alchemy, yet his true strength, the ability to bind and define reality through language, had been at his fingertips all along. Lock it down, Elias, Alistair urged. Use what you truly know. Create a permanent, unbreakable sealing ritual using the characters you spent years deciphering. Let the Ossuary's veil become only a name. Do not let anyone else use this brazier for greed again. You have earned your freedom. Seal that freedom. Alistair's shape began to fade, not with violent dissolution, but as if he were receding from a dream. I am sorry for the burden, he said, his final words a relieved whisper. Then, he was gone entirely, leaving the cold brazier and the last traces of pale smoke dissolving into the air. Elias stood up. Lyra still watched him, fearful but waiting for direction. It's over, Lyra, Elias said, his voice no longer carrying the stiff coldness of the caretaker, but the decisiveness of a man with purpose. This door will never open again. He turned his back on the brazier. The weight was gone. The revulsion had settled into steel resolve. The Ossuary's veil would not be abandoned. It would be sealed, locked by its own language. Elias walked toward his private library, where stacks of ancient books, forgotten rubbings of syntax and semantics, awaited him. He had been imprisoned for 5 years, doing his father's work. Now, he chose his own, not the keeper of the gate, but the final protector, wielding the sharpest tool he possessed, the knowledge of the old tongue. Elias grasped the lexicon of the eternal language. He was no longer afraid. This new responsibility was his freedom.